Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show where I look ahead to the future and look back on the week that was. So if you're new, make sure you like the videos, and if you're a regular, please subscribe so that you get alerts when new episodes are out. So I hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend. Remember, this is a day supposed to honor the fallen, and while all gave some gave their all. So I will briefly begin by saying we still do not know, as of this recording, much about the peace deal that was supposedly signed between Iran and the White House, and indeed it doesn't seem to be a peace deal. It just seems to be a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which has been blocked since the end of February. And there are some aspects, quite a few aspects still to be negotiated, but it looks like the Strait will be reopened, and hopefully that means an end to the blockade, and oil prices will drop at least a little bit. So let's not get blown around by events, shall we? So on this Memorial Day, the president still is a very unpopular president and only seems to be getting more unpopular by the week. So why might this be? Well, like Joe Biden before him, people are unhappy with the president's stewardship of the country. And if you look at the economic metrics, it's actually not too bad. It's definitely gotten worse because of the war. If you go back to February 28th, it looked better than it did today. But even before the war began, the numbers were not too bad economically. So why is Trump and his administration so unpopular? Well, I have a theory. Pew Research did some polling a couple of weeks ago and found the issues that Americans care most about. And I don't want to throw a bunch of numbers at you because some of you are driving, some of you are walking, some of you are at work or whatever. So I'm not going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. Instead, we're going to kind of keep this very general. Except we're going to say that all of them have increased since President Trump took office. So all these issues that are big issues have become bigger concerns than they were in January and February of 2025. So they are in order of most important to least important. It's healthcare affordability, inflation, the federal deficit, and bipartisanship. And if you dig into the partisan data, it's clear that independents have been concerned about these at similar rates. But as soon as Joe Biden walked out of the Oval Office, Democrats became more concerned about these issues and Republicans became less concerned. The same thing happened in 2021. So what has the president done to address these issues? Really not very much. So we'll start with the affordability of healthcare. This is the top issue rated by over 70% of Americans. With the exception of Trump RX, which I talked about at the end of last year, the president has done very little to help with this. In fact, he has done nothing. With the expiration of the Affordable Care Act subsidies that Democrats extended in 2021, it ended last year, this has gotten worse. So what about inflation? Well, the war has only made inflation worse. It's almost 4% now, which is the highest in about 3 years. And what about the budget deficit? Well, this has actually gotten a little bit better than expected, but he plans to make it worse by increasing military spending by over $600 billion. So that has also gotten worse. Bipartisanship has also gotten worse. If you follow politics, would you say that relationships between parties has gotten better or worse? If you think better, please let me know in the comments and explain why. So think about if you're a swing voter. You probably share at least one of these concerns that I mentioned. Unemployment was also named as a concern, by the way, but it was, as you saw on the graphic that I put on screen, but it was not a super high concern. It definitely increased quite a bit, increased 11%. It was not a top issue as of this moment. And I know for me, I share all of these concerns. And all four of them I think will be getting worse, including the unemployment. So all five of them will get worse. And the most alarming is probably the budget deficit. And if you're a swing voter, you think if none of these issues are being addressed, why would you vote for Republicans to continue the agenda that Trump laid out? And you might think, well, Trump did focus on issues in his first year and a half in office. And, well, I would just say out of thin air that these issues were international terrorism, tax cuts, illegal immigration, and American imperialism. So international terrorism, just 38% of Americans say that's a big concern. 38% of Americans say illegal immigration is a big concern. Foreign policy isn't even in the research. Usually that's always quite low. And instead of focusing what the American people are concerned about, the president has been focused on adventures across the world in Iran, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Latin America, and in Greenland. And if you look at research polling from May 2022, which, by the way, all of this is linked below, this was when Joe Biden was still president, you can see that some of the top issues Joe Biden was addressing, or at least he was pretending to, like healthcare affordability and gun violence. Those were issues that they ran on in the midterms elections, as well as abortion. This partially explains why Joe Biden was more popular at this point in his term than Trump is now. And as I said, all of this is linked below. Before we move on, or now we're going to move on. We're going to do some Democrat bashing. I always like to keep things fair around here. The DNC released its 2024 autopsy last week, and they were essentially bullied into doing it by the media. This had been something that they had tried to do, not do for months and months and months. But we'll kind of take the big takeaways of the report, and I think firstly, let's talk about what it does not mention. The 192-page document does not mention the president's age. It does not mention Israel, Gaza, or anything about Tim Walz as the vice presidential candidate. This is a big problem. Biden's age was definitely a factor in the 2024 loss. However, his age was a concern long before the primaries began. You can find polling. Couldn't find it, the specific polling, but you can find things from July 2022 about how Democrats did not want Biden to run again and cited age as a concern. So there is that. There is no doubt, though, that Israel and Gaza drove some voters to Trump in key swing states like Michigan, and probably depressed turnout in urban areas in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and North Carolina. Trump ran on no more wars, which we now know wasn't the case, but Kamala did not have a clear policy on how to end the war in Gaza. She didn't lay it out and explain it to the American people, which she didn't do a lot of in that campaign. And lastly, before we move on to what the report did include, the report did not include Tim Walz himself. Tim Walz, as I said, is not mentioned. He was a poor choice as a candidate. I think on policy he was quite fine. He was definitely economic populist. I think people on the left really like that. And from the people I've spoken to, I know a lot of economic populists on the left, at least in my own life, and they were quite excited about Tim Walz. They thought he would have been a better presidential candidate. And I don't know if I agree with that, but I think he would have been better than Kamala. I don't know if he would have been the best presidential candidate. And I think he would have struggled as vice president because it was clear he was not ready for the national spotlight and the attention that the office would have given him. However, Walz will not be running for office again, so this shouldn't be a problem in the future. So what does this report include? The most damning sentence comes on page 71, which reads, "The White House did not position or prepare the vice president. Had the White House explored and evaluated ways to leverage Kamala Harris earlier in the administration, perhaps it would have improved the president's standing, and it clearly would have prepared for her to lead the ticket." And this is clearly the case. This is something I think I said even before Kamala entered the race and Biden dropped out. Kamala was not given a lot of high-profile roles, and that's because I think Biden didn't want to. He wanted to run the show, and he wanted to run the show for 8 years. And that was a surprise because I knew Joe Biden would not have lasted 8 years in the Oval Office. I predicted he probably would be on his deathbed right about now if he was reelected. And we saw during the campaign, and this was true even when she was in office as vice president, she was a horrible speaker. Even years before 2024, she was incoherent, condescending, and worst of all, spoke in circles. This is all well-known stuff. She also spoke in platitudes, which people these days do not like. Now, I would rather somebody speak in platitudes professionally than what we have now, but it was still not well-liked, and I think I'm in the minority in my view. And the report itself has some obvious errors, and to the DNC's credit, they do point these out in there. They even highlight all of them, and this report, once again, is linked below. It states that, for example, Republican Speaker John Boehner resigned in 2014 when he actually resigned in 2015. It is wrong about how many votes decided the presidency in certain states, how many people stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and more and more and more. And as I said, to give the great DNC credit, they did point these out, and it is linked below if you would like to read it for yourself. But the broad conclusions I do agree with. I would also add that Joe Biden should have never picked Kamala Harris in 2020, and that was the chain of events that set off the 2024 election years before it even began. And if you think about it, that one decision to pick Kamala Harris in 2020 will have 9 years of implications. It will have implications into 2029 and possibly beyond. I'm not sure who would have been better in every way, but Kamala was worse in every way. And he made a choice based off of race and gender alone and a lack of actual talent, and that torpedoed the Democrats' chances. Quite ironic. And my question is, what went into making this report? It is a piece of garbage, and it makes sense why they didn't want to release it. You think they would have hired a whole team to write this? It seems like it was something that one person only wrote. It's lazy, it's not well edited, there's few if any graphics, and this would be a PR disaster if people actually cared about this. And we're not really going to go much further because we could spend a year's worth of episodes going line by line. But I would say this is a sign the DNC needs to step this up before the next election. And I would say that both major parties should release a report after each election, whether they win or lose. And as far as I know, they had no report in 2020 because they won, so they didn't see the need to. In summary, Democrats will try to dismiss this report, but there is some truth to it, even though it is hot garbage. If you remember last year, I made a podcast when they were selecting the DNC chair, and they were saying Kamala lost because of her race and gender. Almost all the candidates said that. I think even the one who won said that, and that is categorically false. And I can think of 10 other reasons she lost that don't have to do with her race and gender, like the economic conditions, Joe Biden's approval rating, her lackluster speaking abilities, her lack of policies, her vice presidential pick, Biden staying in the race too long, there was no competitive primary, and on and on and on. I can keep going, but we have to stop at some point. And I will end this segment with this. Democrats believed this happened in 2016, that she lost because of her race and gender, which is not true, but why in an election where they said the stakes were higher than ever before did they risk it with a black woman if they believed that Kamala Harris was going to face this problem? Why didn't they go with Big G Gavin Newsom? He's a white man. He would have been a safer pick according to them. So as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So before we move on, we will discuss some elections that we had in Kentucky last week. Looking back, Thomas Massie in Kentucky, he faced a primary challenge, and I thought he was going to win his primary because he had survived so many primaries before, but he lost. He has been in Congress since the end of 2012, and he was one of the big names to get the Epstein files released, along with Marjorie Taylor Greene and I believe Nancy Mace, and he also criticized the war in Iran. He has a long history of voting against establishment Republicans, and he ended up losing. It turned out to be the most expensive U.S. House race in history. In his concession speech, he declared, if the legislative branch always votes whichever the way the wind is blowing, then we have mob rule. He even hinted he might run in 2028. I assume he means for Congress, not for president. And obviously, the White House took a victory lap, and I doubt he will ever come back. Massie lost by 10 points, and that was quite shocking. He should have won this, considering everything that happened. He should have won. However, looking ahead, there is another big beast that we expect to lose his seat, and I talked about this before, and we're going to talk about it again next week for sure, and that's Texas Senator John Cornyn. And Trump finally made an endorsement, and I said all the way back in March I thought he would endorse Cornyn's opponent, Ken Paxton, and it turns out I was correct. Trump picked Paxton, and I think with that, Cornyn will absolutely lose his primary, and Paxton will be the nominee. It's not a surprise in my eyes, but Senate Republicans are furious. In fact, they dropped the $1.8 billion compensation to January 6 attackers because they were prosecuted. There was supposed to be a compensation fund, and Republicans dropped it. So I would not be surprised if in the months and possibly years ahead, they see it as Trump is buying loyalty in his party, like he's only rewarding loyalty, but they're going to be in the minority. So what good is it if you have a loyal party if you're in the minority? So they're obviously upset about it. It's something Don Bacon said. And you might wonder, well, why are Senate Republicans so upset? Well, Ken Paxton is a very corrupt politician. He pled guilty to felonies. He was going to go to prison, but instead had to pay a house's worth of money and do 100 hours of community service. So I'm thinking with this seat has a stronger chance of going to the Democrats. We are going to cover these results next, although in truth, much of the polling for the general election is within the margin of error. Cornyn could theoretically still win the primary and the general, but considering Bill Cassidy's and Thomas Massie's defeat earlier this month, I expect this to be the end. So the primary is on May 26th. That is tomorrow, if you're listening to this on Memorial Day. And then on June 2nd, we will have the California governor primary, and we will learn the top 2 candidates for governor. And this will be the last thing we talk about. This is a safe state for Democrats, and this is a contest to see which Democrats can make it into the top 2. It's a very fragmented race, and nobody's polling over 25%. Republican Steve Hilton is likely to be in the top 2, although not all polling shows that. My guess is we will see Hilton versus Xavier Becerra. Hilton is a Republican candidate. Becerra worked in the Biden administration. There's also billionaire Tom Steyer. There's former Congresswoman Katie Porter, who yells at her staff. And then there's MAGA man Chad Bianco, another Republican, and then a bunch of others that really have no chance of winning. So as I said, it is a fragmented race. The only way Republicans would win this race is if no Democrats advance to a general election. And what I mean is if Bianco and Hilton advanced, then it would be red on red in one of the bluest states in the country. However, Trump made endorsement to Hilton, so I think it's unlikely that Bianco will get enough support to split the Republican vote. And ironically for Hilton, if he could get some of his supporters to vote for Bianco, he would have a better chance of winning. They both would. But since Eric Swalwell dropped out, there's not enough Democratic candidates to split the vote. Even if the roughly 40% of the vote in a good year that Republicans would get in California split 2020, there's likely that a Democrat gets 21 or 22%. So it's pretty unlikely, although, not going to lie, considering the state of California, I do hope a Republican becomes governor. So that is all for now. As always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I am an author of 2 books. One of them is behind me, so if you want to learn more about me, then check those out in the description below. And as always, we will see you again next week on, I believe, June the 2nd or June the 1st, and see you then. Bye-bye.